Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, and every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. But there went up a mist from the earth, and watered the whole face of the ground. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden. There he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden. From thence it was parted and became into 4 heads. The name of the first is Pison, for that is it which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. There is bdellium and the onyx stone, and the name of the second river is Gihon. The same is it that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. And the name of the third river is Hiddekel. That is it which goeth toward the east of Assyria. And the fourth river is Euphrates. And the Lord God took the man and put him into the garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. And the Lord God said, It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an help meet for him. And out of the ground the Lord formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. And Adam gave names to all cattle, and to the fowl of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found an help meet for him. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs, and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. Let's sing together the hymn number 124. Hymn number 124. Turning now to the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verse 1. The book of Genesis, chapter 2, verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And our subject is the Garden of Eden. We'll be looking at the first chapter of the book of Genesis and seeing its remarkable structure and its depths and its great wonders and all that we have to learn. Some of the things we've been through rather quickly in summary manner, and we proceed into this second chapter now. Now, it's often said that Genesis chapter 1 is completely contradicted by Genesis chapter 2. Right at the very beginning of the Bible, the alleged discrepancies begin to be claimed. And this is very common. I suppose among the first people to cast serious doubt on the consistent record of Genesis 1 and 2 were theologians, that is to say unbelieving, liberal theologians who produced different theories to the effect that Genesis 1 had one author and Genesis 2 had quite a different author, and so on, and that they were conflicting accounts. But there's no conflict between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Also, there are many popular attacks on the book of Genesis, beginning in these very foundational chapters, to cast doubt on the Bible. And generally run along these lines. There is one order of creation in chapter 1 and quite a different order of creation in chapter 2. And you'll find all these kind of things manage to find their way to the top of the search engines, and if people were to Google Genesis or Adam and Eve or anything like that, among the first things they would be referred to are various articles just expressing these ideas, that this is a complete mass of contradiction, first and second chapters of Genesis. More often than not written by people who don't seem to know their Bibles, don't understand what they're reading, have never looked at the narrative carefully, and yet that's one of the iniquities of the internet. If you haven't a clue what you're doing, you can get to the top of the search engine pages quite easily. And certainly on a topic like this, you may be a very popular port of call for many people, doubters and so on. You may be endlessly referenced, and that's how it works out. Well, I don't want to talk too much about this, but there's no contradiction between the first two chapters of Genesis. They're by one author, they're presented as such, they're presented as historical, and it's foolish ignorance. When you look closely, and I'm not going to do it tonight, you can do it for yourself, at all these alleged contradictions, it's quite obvious to any reader, whatever their depth of knowledge, that there are no contradictions, that things are being completely misquoted and misused. But we look at chapter 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. Matter of fact, I can remember some 50 years ago going through the discrepancies in Genesis 1 and 2 with an older teenage Bible class. And here's a recommendation for you with Bible classes and college classes. It's a great theme, as long as you don't make it too complicated. It's very easy to show. Just another example of how the enemy of souls so easily misleads people. There are two trees in the Garden of Eden, in the midst of the Garden of Eden, the tree of life and the tree of death, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And as the old Puritans used to love to point out, the preoccupation of Satan before the fall was to try to persuade our first parents to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, so that they would surely die. And ever since then, it's the tree of life which has been presented to fallen men and women, and it's the enemy's chief occupation to persuade people not to eat of the tree of life. And you can sum up the whole of satanic activity by that simple picture and illustration. But let's look at this tremendous second chapter. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. Again, it has even been translated the ornaments or the furniture of space and the earth. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made. Creation from nothing came to an end. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. Of course, the animals and plants have been mentioned, space, the stars, the sun, the moon, all culminating in man, and as I mentioned last study, no mention of the angels, because they're not part of the host of the heavens and the earth. The heavens here being space, material space, not the celestial realm, not the realm of God's abode. So it's the occupants of the created skies and earth who are altogether mentioned in these passages. And on this second verse, on the seventh day, let us understand that to mean by the seventh day. Again, people say, well, there's a contradiction here. You have 6 days of creation, and now you have a seventh. It's perfectly obvious, I would think, to anyone, that not even the most elementary writer would make a mistake as big as that and contradict himself in the space of just a few words. No, we obviously intended to understand that by the seventh day all was done. No contradiction with the previous sentences, that the creation is chronicled in 606 days, and then God finishes his creative work. He rests. So it is said. God does not need to rest, of course. He's inexhaustible. He's eternal power and energy and action. He continues to work, in a sense, to even sustain the universe and to develop it. But he rests in the sense that he ends his creation from nothing work, and he makes a perfect world. No thorns, no briars. In chapter 3 and verse 18, they are now to be introduced. And thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee. They were not there before. No predators, no death. That's clear from verse 17 of chapter 3, rather verse 17 of this second chapter. Death comes with the eating of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. By the way, are we talking about 7 literal days? It certainly appears to. Evening and morning being described for each day of creation. 6 literal days. And 7 great New Testament texts. 1 the words of Christ, 6 the words of the Apostle Paul, that refer to the Garden of Eden and creation as though literally accomplished over 6 literal days. So we're in no doubt that if the Bible is its own interpreter, they were 6 24-hour days. But I want to take you immediately down to verse 3 of chapter 2. And God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. The Sabbath principle, the day of rest. It's made a blessed day. He blessed it. He sanctified it, which means he set it apart and declared it to be holy. It's a day of favour. It's a day of privileges. It's clearly a commemoration of creation. On the 7th day, there is inaugurated a special day. God did not do this for his benefit. God doesn't dwell in time as we do. He would not declare a day in time, a day of the week, from that time on to be special and blessed and sanctified and made holy. It is, of course, for man's benefit that this was done. And so we have the creation ordinance of a day of rest. And here it is the seventh day, a time for worship. If Adam and Eve had continued in bliss and in life in the garden, there would have been a Sabbath rest every seventh day. In the event they fell, but that creation ordinance stands. And we may well assume that those first generations kept the Sabbath rest, the memorial of creation, of God's great work. That's what an ordinance that was established then. The best of days to enjoy, a day for God, a day for reflection. Of course, it was made law from the time of Moses, the fourth commandment, and it was linked to this creation ordinance. Remember the Sabbath day, as though to say it's always been in force. It always was an obligation from the very beginning for man to reflect and to have this day set aside for God. And so it is today. In the time of the New Testament, the apostles, no doubt by direct inspiration, began instead from the very beginning to meet on the first day of the week, the day of resurrection. And the day plainly by divine authority was changed from the seventh to the first, but the Sabbath principle remains. And so we believe in the Sabbath rest. A pastor came to see me once, and we were talking about different things, and I can't remember how we got to it, but suddenly he said to me, almost proudly, almost defiantly, "I am not a Sabbatarian." And he despised the notion of the fourth commandment and the principle of the fourth commandment applying for today. What a tragedy. What a great shame. But there are churches where it isn't taught, where it's ignored, where people take in entertainment and all kinds of things on the Lord's Day. But here is the creation ordinance, beginning in verse 2. At the time of Moses, it picked up a significance which went beyond simply creation. Or did I say simply creation? That's a massive and a wonderful thing to commemorate week by week. But the redemption of the people and their deliverance from Egypt, and redemption became a great part of the theme. So in the New Testament, the day of resurrection. And when you speak of resurrection, you speak inevitably also of Calvary and atonement, resurrection from what? So those great themes came in the New Testament. And that's the Lord's Day that we have to this day. I go down to verse 4. These are the generations of the heaven and of the earth. Modern versions tend to lose the word generations, which is a great shame. And they use alternative words. This is the history of, or this is the account of, or things like that. But generations is in the original. It's actually important, because although it doesn't seem readily to fit in this particular verse, there are altogether 10 uses of this in the book of Genesis. I mentioned this last study. These are divisions of the book of Genesis. These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth. If you look on to chapter 5 and verse 1, this is the book of the generations of Adam. And then the immediate descendants of Adam and Eve are listed and chronicled and so on. And this term is used repeatedly for different stages of the history in the book of Genesis. But it begins, the first time it's used is in chapter 2 and verse 4. These are the generations not of Adam, that's going to follow in chapter 5, although some of his descendants are certainly mentioned in chapter 4. But these are the generations not of Adam, but of the heavens and of the earth. What does it mean? Well, it would appear to mean this, that God creates the heavens, space, and the earth, and then God so works that the earth, as though it's a person, the earth brings forth what? The plants, of course, and the animals, and then from the dust of the ground, or as Luther had it in the German, from a lump of earth, Adam. So the earth is seen almost as a parent. Here are the first, the immediate generations who came straight out of earth. Adam and Eve, who came out of Adam. So those two, they're the progeny, if you like. They're the descendants of earth. And so the first section is, here are the generations of the heaven and earth, the first beings. And then in chapter 5, it'll be, here are the generations of Adam. Now, it's interesting to note this, because you can see that from chapter 2 and verse 4, there is another subject. When people say there are contradictions between chapter 1 and chapter 2, they're ignorant of this. But chapter 2 and verse 4 says, now we begin a subsection, a section of its own. We're now going to deal with the children, as it were, of the dust of the earth. The progeny, the children of the created beginning world. And so more information is given about Adam, his home that was provided for him, and so on. And subsequently in chapter 3, his fall. And so inevitably you're not now dealing with an order of creation. You're dealing with what actually happened to the man, the first man. Well, they don't recognize that, the people who are looking for trouble. They don't understand. The two chapters are dealing with different subjects. One, the order of creation. The other, what happened to the first man. So we look at it in that light. Verse 4 of chapter 2. These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created in the day, used there in a general sense, you could translate it in the age, that the Lord God made the heavens and the earth and every plant of the field. But look how careful the record is to make it clear to us that this is a general statement, because every plant of the field, let's insert a bracket there, before it was in the earth. It's pointing out that we're really only talking about day 3, as described in the previous chapter. The plants haven't been made, strictly speaking, at the time the earth and the heavens were made. And every herb of the field, it's down here in verse 5, brackets, before it grew. So the chapter is most careful to point out that this is not a rewrite of a different order of creation. It's a general sweeping statement that God made everything, but lest you should misunderstand, because it's going to talk about the mist that came out of the earth. This was actually, strictly speaking, before the plants were made. And so it was. It's tying in with the previous chapter. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. That means to say that man wasn't there yet. He wasn't created until the 6th day. Well, that's very clear and plain and careful. But at that stage, verse 6, there went up a mist. Some people translate it springs. Maybe right. Mist in our version, from the earth, and watered the whole face of the ground. And what we're reminded of from this is that man had no part in the bringing about of plant life in the world. It wasn't there. There wasn't a man to till the ground. And there was no rain. And God watered the earth, and then he produced the plants from the earth, and then after that, we're up to day 6, verse 7, the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, from a clod of earth, and breathed into his nostrils directly the breath of life, animation, and the soul. And man became a living soul. So God breathed in something special to man that was not breathed into the animals. Oh, how foolish the critics are. They say, God did not, according to this, breathe a soul into man until he was made and developed, because he breathed it into his nostrils. How foolish! Nobody expects this to be that literal. For this to be said, the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils. That's a figure of speech. It breathed in. You don't take every single word literally. Oh, he was made, and then subsequently he was given a soul. The way people savage these accounts in a way that you would never do to any literature. No, God formed him and breathed in, and man became a living soul. And verse 8, the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden. Now there's some geography in these verses. I'm not going to give much attention to that, but there evidently was a time when you could quite clearly determine where the Garden of Eden had been. Now it wasn't there anymore. After the fall, and especially after the flood, one can see all kinds of scope for any signs of that precious place to be eradicated. Many people think it was probably under this particular desert, others say that particular desert, some place it in Iraq, some place it in other places. There is a little bit of geography here, but we don't have sufficient knowledge to understand it. There was a time when people could figure it out with the names of the rivers and everything else, and get some intelligent idea. It was a definite place. Eastward in or of Eden. Eden was a region of the newly created earth, and at a particular point to the east of it, the Garden of Eden is planted. There's some beautiful words here. At the end of verse 8, there he put the man whom he had formed. I noted last week the craftsman terms that keep coming up in these first chapters. It was care and design, formed by God. And verse 9, you have it again. Out of the ground God made certain things, made the Lord God to grow. And the words are building words that are employed in the text. So there's the craftsman at work. Not usually words that we associate with a garden, but they're there. Out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight. It was the most beautiful place of all, and good for food, variety of fruits, which could fully satisfy his need of diet. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge and good and evil. And we'll talk about these things a little more as we go on. And verse 10, according to the geography, and a river went out of Eden, was sourced in Eden to water the garden, and from its source it was parted at some point and became 4 heads, and the names are given, which don't mean very much to us today. But still there's a message in it, and the message is that this was a definite place. And it was a place with water sources and beautiful trees and perfect food, and it could at some time be identified in some way, though it wouldn't have been the same as it was in earliest times. Verse 15, and the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. And we learn very much from this also. Now he didn't have to work in a way that was onerous or difficult for him. That came later with the curse. Chapter 3, verse 19, in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread till thou return unto the ground. But there was no hardship for man in the Garden of Eden. So we see him dressing it and keeping it as more, not hard work, but his capacities, his wonderful capacities and abilities, having an application and having fulfillment, and beautiful things to do. If you're a gardener and you know about gardening, there are some things you enjoy doing and there are some things you don't enjoy doing. The chores and the difficult things. Take all the latter away and you get some idea of the Garden of Eden. Only the fulfilling things, the enjoyable things, the constructive things, the wonderful things. There was no hard work, and there was no pain, and there was no sweat in the Garden of Eden. So who was put in the Garden of Eden to dress it and keep it? Even before the fall, man was made a person who must be active and fulfilled and must work in the very best sense of the word. And so it is today. If you're not working, you're unhappy. You're bored. Or you're not fulfilled. And people say, I'm looking forward to retirement. I'm going to retire, you see. And they think retirement, rest, ease, but it's not fulfilling. It's not really happy. And they wish they could do something positive and constructive and useful and so on. Because that's what we're made for. And so it was in the Garden of Eden. And then you get the command in verse 16. Here is the covenant test that was put upon man. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat wonderful fruits, a much greater diversity of fruit and taste and texture than we know today, I'm quite sure. And he could freely eat of those things. But verse 17, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat it. Well, we can pause there. It wasn't in this covenant test that man was commanded to accomplish something. He was sinless, he was perfect, he was happy being fulfilled in keeping the garden. The test wasn't a command to do something, it was, if you like, the easiest kind of command. It was a command to not do something. And to not do something which he had no need to do. He didn't need the knowledge of good and evil. He didn't know what it was. He didn't need it. It didn't make him go short of anything. It was a command not to do something. In other words, the great test was not to be hostile to the will of God. Not to oppose the will of God. That was all. You will have bliss, happiness, fulfillment, every wonderful thing, but don't oppose the will of God, and trust him and what he says, and look to him for everything. That was the test. And as we shall see in chapter 3, the man failed, because the woman hasn't been brought into it yet. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day, at once, immediately, that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. And as we shall see in due course, immediately man fell, he died in any number of respects. His fulfillment died. His perfect happiness died. His perfect peace died. His intimate communion with God died. His status died. His eternal blessedness died. His immortality was recalled by God. And he was at serious risk. And he died physically. Not altogether, but he began to die physically. Death came in, and his body began the process of death. He was as good as dead. He died as soon as he fell. And that was the warning. It was a covenant test. But we'll develop the idea of covenant a little more later. And we go to this astonishing 18th verse. Because before we go to the fall, we have to bring in the woman. The account is very careful. Verse 18, and the Lord God said, it is not good that the man should be alone. He must have a companion. He is made for companionship. He must have an associate in the work, in that wonderful, positive, enjoyable, immensely fulfilling work of the Garden of Eden. And the Lord God said, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an help meet for him. Why did he need help? Well, for his pleasure and enjoyment and sharing as a social being. So a woman would be brought to Adam. Again, there's no contradiction as it goes on in the order of creation described in chapter 1. Verse 19, out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. So the animals are brought and they're named. How many animals did Adam name? We're not told. May have been representatives of each species, and may have been an enormous number. But he was brought and they came, and there being no predators at that time, and no claws adapted for evil use, and gaping jaws, and venom, well, they were docile before Adam. And there's a great message in verse 19. Adam was established not only as a zoology student and the most knowledgeable person and the namer of all things. You see, not only does he work to tend enjoyable work in the Garden of Eden, he's a student. He's an inquiring man. Man is made for this. Man is made to be the master of creation, to look into things and understand them, and explore them, and describe them. And Adam begins that great function given to man by naming every living creature. No doubt in very intelligent terms that truly described each beast. Some people see in verse 19 a limitation in beasts because beasts of the field are mentioned, whereas previously they've been called beasts of the earth, as though there's a limitation in the category of animals brought in. Anyway, he names the animals. Verse 20, Adam gave names to all cattle, fowl of the air, every beast of the field, but for Adam there was not found an help meet for him. Now, it's not that this process was an effort to find such a partner for Adam. They mustn't see that implication in the words. It wasn't a conscious search, as though God was searching for a partner for Adam, or Adam himself was searching, or both together. No, the point of verse 20 is that Adam became certainly increasingly conscious that there was all kinds of life and all kinds of animals and some higher animals, and yet he was alone. He had no companion. He wasn't looking for a companion from them. But when you see so much life in front of you, and male and female, created he them, and so on, and I'm alone. And the verse really is giving us a little insight into Adam's sense of loneliness. I shouldn't put it that way, because this was paradise. And it wasn't the kind of sense of loneliness that would make you unhappy. It was a consciousness that he was alone. He wasn't jealous, he wasn't envious, but he was aware that he was alone. And so, in that context, verse 21, you know the account. The Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs, literally one of his sides, but everybody agrees, quite right, though it's sides in the Hebrew, to translate it rib here. and closed up the flesh instead thereof, and the rib which the Lord God had taken from man, this is so profound, friends, made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. Why did God do it this way? Adam was brought out of the ground, and God breathed into him a living soul. Eve was brought out of Adam. Why? What is so profound about this? Well, Adam got it straight away. Verse 23, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. He understood it straight away. She is the same as he is. She is identical. She's like him. She is bone of his bones, flesh of his flesh. She's exactly the same. The woman wasn't subordinate in the Garden of Eden. That was after the fall. After the fall, women had their joint authority reduced. After the fall, there was a great difference made. And women, well, her desire was unto her husband, and we'll explain that in due course. But from the beginning, she was a counterpart. She was an helpmeet, and that's literally the Hebrew says she was an opposite. But of course everybody realizes that's not what's meant. What's meant is not that she was an opposite, but something very close to it. She was his counterpart. The creation of man wasn't actually complete until the woman was formed, made, built is the word in the Hebrew. And together they constituted mankind. Together. She had things he didn't have. She complemented her. She was his helper, meet, his counterpart. Actually, from the beginning, his equal, his companion. And to some extent, she still is. And although this is an aside, we think of the fall, and we think of some things, the exercise of authority over men, certainly in spiritual matters in the church, the office of teaching men, she is subordinate. I'm not talking about outside spiritual matters or the church, that's another discussion. But her desire is to please the man. Of course, she can rebel against that. And a woman can be very much against her husband, and very hostile to him, and very critical of him, and want to dominate him. But it isn't what's natural for her. For a woman to sin in that way, she's got to overcome something which is natural for her. To want to consider first her husband and follow him. So it's a double sin, if you like. However, there were some things unchanged. She is still his counterpart. She is still his equal, in a sense. He needs her. And though he is to be her head in marriage and in the church, he'd better consider her and take account of her and be very sensitive and very kind and very careful. And some cultures in the world have got it all wrong. No, he's not only dominant, he's superior. He's special. He can be rough, he can be unkind. He need not take account of her. Her feelings and her views are rubbish and inadequate and inferior. But that's sinful. She was appointed to be his helper. There are some people say a woman mustn't do anything for the Lord. She should stay at home and she could cook the meals and wash the dishes and bring up the children and do as she's told, and that's what she's to do. But in the beginning, she was Adam's equal, his counterpart, his helper, engaged. So, husbands have a duty and a task, born-again husbands with hopefully born-again wives, to potentiate them. Do they not have their areas of Christian service, their right to fulfillment and exercise of gifts for the Lord of glory? Of course they do. And there are some Christian people who deny that. And that's a great sin. That's a great wrong. That's a total failure to read even the narrative of the Garden of Eden. So she was his counterpart. Now, we proceed on that basis, and we read again verse 23. And Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. I've got to look after her." Of course, he didn't have to look after her. No looking after was necessary in the Garden of Eden. It was just blessing and blessedness. However, he might well have said, "I've got to look after her as though she is my very own arms, legs, ribs and body parts. She's bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. We are together and equal and one flesh before the Lord, because she was taken out of man." Verse 24, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother." Who's saying this? Adam's words must finish at the end of verse 23. Unless he's functioning as a prophet, he can't really say verse 24, because fathers and mothers haven't happened yet, let alone leaving of fathers and mothers. This is Moses. These are the inspired words of Moses. An application is inserted into the narrative. "Therefore, says Moses, shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh," of understanding and sharing, and so on. And of course, Moses, writing after the fall, is directing that we should never behave as though the bond between parent and child is greater than the bond between husband and wife. Yet some do. Some parents, or fathers or mothers, one of the two, they try to intrude on, into, and dominate the marital union of their children. And the direction of Moses and the inspired conclusion from all that's said is this: no, when God brings together a man and a woman, that relationship is more important than the duty between parents and children. A new union, a new unit has been created by God as people come together, and parents back off and don't interfere. Give advice, of course, will be politely listened to and honoured, but there's now a new relationship, and that's there in verse 24. Why, again, there were some cultures, and it used to be like this in England years ago. We see it in the books, where the family council can be summoned and imposed upon the married child and his wife or husband. No, that's quite wrong, biblically. It's quite outrageous. Shouldn't be. And then verse 25. "And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed." There was no shame because there was no sin. Shame came with the fall. Shame came with sin and a curse. Shame, it has been said, well, it was consciousness of exposure to lust. And even a man and a wife would find it delicate to be exposed, even to each other, have to accommodate to that. Because there's shame. It's probably a department of conscience. In fallen human beings, God has put a conscience, a kind of indwelling magistrate, to warn us and to accuse us and to clear us. And we try to overcome it and wrestle it to the ground and bludgeon it and silence it. But part of conscience is shame. And shame must be heeded. Shame is part of the conscience operating. Shamelessness is coarseness. Shamelessness is man saying that lust is right and I'm entitled to it. Shame is abandon and rebellion. Shame, it's a precious thing. I am capable of being ashamed. You are capable of being ashamed. And shame particularly attaches to undress. It's a protection. It's a warning. It's a part of conscience. A warning against lust. So we respect it. And as Christians particularly, don't follow the abandon of the world. There's nothing wrong in overexposing garments and so on. Get rid of shame. No, no. That embarrassment, that shame, is a gift of God to a fallen race, and it must be honoured and watched and observed. So we have in chapter 2 the completion of creation, the Sabbath principle, man's course, his purpose, his work, his burden elaborated. You have the garden, the covenant test, a simple law, do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You have the woman equal to the man, the institution of marriage, all these foundational things taking place in a mansion, the most marvelous mansion ever built, the Garden of Eden, the home of Adam and of Eve. Foundational matters, and we go on to deal with the fall and so on in due time. Let's close this evening singing the hymn 574. Hymn number 500.